A very, very warm welcome to the Auroville Literature Festival Day 2. Yesterday, it was the formal inaugural of the LitFest, and a couple of people shared. But today is actually the deep dive into different sessions. The sessions are happening simultaneously in Sri Aurobindo Auditorium, Bharat Nivas campus, and now Unity Pavilion. Throughout the day, there will be sessions on different themes, different topics. It's been a rich amalgamation of authors, not only just from Auroville and Pondicherry, but also from the rest of the country and even India. So it's truly a privilege to have all of them. And today, it's truly a privilege to welcome these PM Yuva authors. And I'm going to allow that to be shared more. What does that really mean? But welcome Sohardya, Ashish, Mithun. And I want to introduce our very own Aurovillians, Lakshay and Vatsala. They're going to help us moderate the sessions. So this session, while it is specially designed for the youth, in Auroville we have a very different understanding of youth. We are here as never-ending youth. But yes, it's beautiful to see youth authors actually being brought into the limelight and being actually promoted by the PM Yuva Chair. And over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sudha. Thank you, Sudha. Thank you all of you for coming here. A warm welcome. And we have these three young, brilliant authors with us. They have won a fellowship under the aegis of Ministry of Education. It's a new venture by the central government, and the scheme is called Yuva. It's for people under the age of 30, and it's also an acronym, so it stands for Young, Upcoming, Versatile Authors. Three people we have here, they are much more than this, and their credentials are awesome. So I'm going to tell you briefly about these people here. So Hardya Dey is an author, student researcher, columnist, and podcaster. His book, Pratap Jung, The Ultimate Sacrifice, is set against the backdrop of the First War of Indian Independence and published by the National Book Trust as part of this project. In addition, he has been a columnist for several national and international dailies, including the Sunday Guardian, and presently serves as sponsorship coordinator under the Treasury segment at the Y20 India Secretariat. So Hardya was conferred the Prime Minister's Rashtriya Bal Shakti Puraskar by the Ministry of Women and Child Development, Government of India, in 2021. He is currently pursuing UG Cert studies in history at the University of Cambridge. His upcoming work on historical fiction is set to be published from Rupa Publications, India. Next, we have Ashisha Chakravarti. She has again won a fellowship in this program where thousands and thousands of people took part. And she's a Right India winner whose best-selling debut novel, Misadventures of a Sales Girl by Rupa Publications, is loosely based on her experiences as a sales manager. She has written for various Readomania anthologies and e-books by Women's Web and Insight IIM. Her articles and interviews have appeared in The Hindu, The Daily Guardian, The Times of India, The Sunday Guardian, She, the people, the corporate citizen, CSR universe, women's web, and so on. She was one of the winners of Kafiya, the Delhi Poetry Festival. A compulsive reader, a visharat in Kathak, and an avid traveler. She is an MBA from the Indian Institute of Foreign Trade, New Delhi, and a computer engineer from Jamia Millia Islamia. She has also modeled for a German photographer and likes to blog on her online diary of sorts, The Mind Bin. So last but not the least, Mithun Murali. He is a writer hailing from Trivandrum, Kerala. He has a master's in English from the Institute of English, Research Department of University of Kerala, and a bachelor's in the same from Mar Ivanios College. He is a UGC NET qualified teacher and an assistant professor of English. Mithun is one of the 75 young writers selected from across India as Prime Minister's Yuva authors. Mithun's poetry and short fiction have been anthologized in multiple collections, one of which, Either Or, Chronicles of the Limitless, won the Auroville International Prize for Fiction. He has a short story collection to his name titled Letter to the Womb and Other Stories. He was invited to read his poems at Mathrubhumi International Festival of Letters. Mithun is a member of Poetry Chain and Kerala International Center Literary Forum.
Thank you, Vatsala. Today's topic of the session is history as rediscovery and reimagination. And we have three beautiful writers from all around India, I guess. I welcome you all to Auroville. And before we begin, I would like to read these three sentences from Savitri. That's in the brochure. It's very nice. O strong forerunner, I have heard thy cry. One shall descend and break the iron law, change nature's doom by the lone spirit's power. So somewhere you all carry this lone spirit's power, and because this is on Yuva writers, so I would like to keep the session also as informal as possible, and we will keep it very conversational. To begin with, we have Sohardya De's book. We will start with that. I will read out a little bit about your books, and then you can give us an intro on how you came up with the idea and what was the process of writing this book. Pratap Jung, The Ultimate Sacrifice by Sohardya De, is a work in the historical fiction genre, written in English, set in Oudh against the backdrop of India's first war of independence, 1857 to 1858. It follows Lal Pratap Singh, a Talukdari prince from the Bisain Rajput dynasty of Kalakankad, as he navigates a treacherous world of court politics and willful British repression. Of the several contemporary developments highlighted in the work, the most significant ones include the events leading to the orchestrated deposition of Nawab Wajid Ali Shah and the underrepresented story of the English defeat at Chinhat, facilitated by Lal Pratap's gambits. With primacy, it explores how this prince, assisted by his strategic mind and battle tactics, steered the Begum's forces, resulting in the odds to briefly fall in Oudh's favor. When all hopes for Oudh were lost, Lal Pratap, with his battalion, the Pratap Jung, faced off against forces of the company led by Colonel Franks, ultimately sacrificing himself alongside servicemen attached to his contingent at the locality called Chanda in 1858, and earning for the battalion the distinction of having been Kaisar Bagh's last defenders. This book significantly relies on primary sources and contemporary accounts such as the widow's reminiscences of the Siege of Lucknow by Catherine Mary Bartram, 1858, a personal narrative of the Siege of Lucknow by Ellie Roots Rees, 1858 again, and journal documentations kept by some of the survivors for intricate reconstruction. In doing so, however, it notably employs critical juxtaposition, also studying several significant documentation such as collections kept in private familial trusts to steer clear of mainstream colonial narratives. So in the tradition of Lucknow, may I invite Sohardya De, pehle aap.
Thank you very much. Am I audible? Thank you very much for that warm introduction, Vatsala ma'am. And thank you for reading out a bit about the work. Before I get talking about the book in particular, I want to set the context of against which the book was particular, against which the idea of having this particular book germinated. So when the PM Yuva scheme was launched, it was as part of the Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav. India was celebrating its 75th year of independence. And the primary aim of the PM Yuva scheme was to retell some of these Indian stories the Indian way. So I think when we talk about archival documents, we talk about repositories, and I've felt, because I've gone through all of these documents and collecting information for my work, many of these have this the mainstream colonial narrative that persists, right? So in order to steer independent of that, what is really important is to go through some of these private familial collections, which I think you mentioned about, you talked about that, and for that NBT assigned us a mentor who was an expert in the field. My mentor, for instance, has studied Lucknow, significantly. We were also given a stipend to actually go visit the area and, get some field work done. So I'll talk about how the idea germinated. Lal Pratap is somebody I didn't come up with, after the PM Yuva scheme came into being. In fact, I think a postage stamp on Lal Pratap, which is also interestingly the cover page for my work, it kind of came out around 2008 to 9. If I remember correctly, by the government of India, Department of Posts. And since I was very young back then, what I used to do is collect all these stamps of, freedom fighters, and I used to write down the names of the literary works, the books that, that were used to be on them, or certain documentations that centered around their activities. Lal Pratap featured in the list with some of the other, very popular freedom fighters as well, but unfortunately we didn't have any particular work on Lal Pratap. So this is the first work that navigates around Lal Pratap's doings during the First War of Indian Independence. So in particular, I had Lal Pratap in mind. I think I came across this postage stamp around 2014 or 15. This was released in 2008 or 9. I was around 5 to 6 back then. And I came across this around 2014 to 15. And, after the PM Yuva scheme came into being, I think the urge of actually retelling his story sort of surfaced. And that's when I began working on his story in particular. Talking a bit about the research framework, which I had to go through in order to give light to this particular work, because like you said, it relies a lot on contemporary accounts, documents, and I think that's really important, because in order to be able, in order for a historical fiction writer to be able to intricately reconstruct the world and to ensure the audience is particularly immersed in that particular world that you recreate, it's essential to set the tone and the thematic components right, and for that you need to go through all these contemporary accounts, even the familial collections, to get the Indian perspective correctly. So for that, I followed a very structured framework when it came to the research bit. Now, could be a little unconventional. We talk about Indian literature because, like ma'am was saying a while back, Indian literature relies mostly on, the very personal, the very emotional bit. Research being seen as something scientific, something where we have a structured, phasing, we have a structured set of, framework to follow. The primary bit, the secondary bit, and post which comes a tertiary, a broad-ranging overview of, how things happened. So yeah, I followed it in a like manner. So primary sources, I think you mentioned quite a few of them, which was also, I think, furthered by the fact that we had access to all these repositories, thanks to the grants by the National Book Trust and, the access that we were provided. Second comes the secondary resources. So if I mention, I think Lal Pratap's father, Hanuman Pratap, was actually the talukdar back then. And I particularly wanted to, study his work because in India, history has always been very capital-centric. So if you talk about Delhi for that matter, Indian history, the history that we study, the mainstream history, it's been a very selective representation. So it's been very capital-centric in the sense that we talk about the kings of Delhi, the sultans and everything. So it's very capital-centric. Even in Oud, for that matter, we talk only about the activities in Lucknow, and we do not delve beyond that. We do not, kind of move further, like inward. And that's something I did because I felt it was really essential to also highlight the role played by certain talukdars, in the freedom struggle. Lal Pratap in particular, because Lal Pratap's father, Hanuman Pratap, who was the talukdar back then, I think his story was particularly brought into limelight by Rudrangshu Mukherjee, a very popular historian. And I studied that when I was, I think, prepping for some examination. It was only post that I got to know about the talukdari of Kalakankar. So, I did some interviews of, people around, people who used to know Lal Pratap and his family well, so as to have that very personal insight into, how things used to go about. And particularly because I wanted to figure out how Lal Pratap, somebody from an upper, a more elitist section of the society, could inspire the masses to, follow him and to sort of lead them. As part of the campaign that he organized against the English. Because in particular, if you look at Oud, it was under the Nawab, right? So Lal Pratap had nothing to do with Oud. He was a feudatory, but not all feudatories participated. Lal Pratap was, I think, an exception. And so yeah, that's particularly how the idea germinated, and I think I also talked a bit about how the book came into being. So, it essentially delves into that. I also have quite a few of these British officers, the manner in which they went about their daily drudgery, because, being in an alien land, being exposed to a very tropical climate back then, and the disadvantages that they faced were things that caused the defeat at Chinhat in particular. And interestingly, I think it was Sir Henry Lawrence, a very popular military officer, who was defeated at Chinhat. We don't often talk about these battles, we talk about the battles. We tend to remember, we have this very, what should I say, a very selective representation. We tend to remember battles where the British, became victorious or triumphant in some manner or the other. And my attempt has been, along with, highlighting Lal Pratap's works, also to bring about some of these contemporary but underrepresented events, such as, you talked about the orchestrated deposition. So Wajid Ali Shah was actually impressed with a certain characterization, he was accused of being somebody who favored debauchery and everything, which he was not, in fact. He was loved by his people. So, I think that particularly came from the work of Sleeman, who served as the resident commissioner in Oud around that point of time, and Dalhousie, kind of used that to gain his ground. So yeah, it was particularly about, I think, changing the narrative, particularly about exploring the other bit of it. So that's kind of what inspired me to delve into the work and, probably bring it out as well. So I think that's it from my end concerning the work.
Hello. Thank you, Sohardya. I have few threads to kind of connect back to, but I will come back to it after. Let's have authors also give their intro to their book, and then we will come back to it. Next we have Ashisha Chakravarti, and her book based on the true story of Rani Gaidanliu, who led the struggle of the Nagas against the British Raj during the fight for independence. The 13-year-old queen and her inherited destiny is the title of the book. Is a work of historical fiction written by Ashisha Chakrabarti in English. The Rongmei Nagas of Kambiron are waiting desperately for a redeemer when young Dikanang is born with shamanic potential. When the colonial rulers exploit the simple natives and their homeland, Dikanang spearheads the Hiraka movement for self-rule and freedom. As the spirit of independence takes root and the village seer predicts the arrival of a queen, Dikanang's cousin, the 13-year-old Dejanliu, emerges as a strong fighter and healer who has an unusual way with animals, particularly the python. Under the leadership of the 13-year-old feisty Dejanliu, the Nagas defy the British officials, protest against the unfair taxes, and spark a revolution for independence. Leading to Dikanang's arrest and execution on false charges of murder, Dejanliu emerges as a natural leader to carry the movement forward. Set in the tri-junction of the states of Assam, Manipur and Nagaland in the northeast India, between 1900 to 1950, the book captures the support and hopes, the pains and anguish of betrayal, and hence the ebb and flow. Hello. Hello. Am I audible? Hello. Yeah. So, the book captures the support and hopes, the pains and anguish of betrayal, and hence the ebb and flow of the struggles of a brave, committed leader. It gives an animated account of a historical scene which contested the worldviews of the colonial rulers and the natives, and also the resultant conflicts between the two. The book makes history come alive as it pulsates through the words of the characters, the suspense, and the thrills of anticipating what is up next. Can you give us a little bit of cues? What is up next in the book?
Sure. So first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to this wonderful, enlightening and a very new world of Auroville, away from the bustling metropolises we are used to. The book came up because I always am drawn to those characters whose stories we've not heard, whose feelings and whose names these are not household names. Gaidenliu was a tough word to pronounce even for me. All the words, her tribe, the way she came from the Rongmei tribe, and there is a complete Zilong tribe right now, which she sort of unified 3 tribes to make it into. I had no idea of all of these. And I have a couple of relatives up there in the northeast, and I decided that probably this is where I should base my next writing on. So this particular woman attracted me for 2 reasons. First, whenever I went on the web, I could find 1 paragraph, maximum 2, on every web page. Every web page does that, You have just 1 or 2 paragraphs and no extra information about the person. Then I kind of created a proposal. The PM Yuva scheme asked us to, according to the submission guidelines, you have 3 sample chapters. You create your idea, what the book is going to be about, and the freedom fighter you're going to be writing on, and what's the basis. I created it on her, and I wasn't too sure that it would be selected, because we don't have a lot of information about her. Thankfully and miraculously, it was selected, and I was assigned a mentor. The person who I was assigned, Dr. Rajingliu Kamei, is actually a professor of Delhi University, and she is from the same village as Gaidenliu. So she came to me with a lot of information. She gave me books, unpublished photographs, a lot of such information which no one knew about. And then we did some primary research. We spoke to people, took some letters, as you will hear from my fellow authors as well, private letters, thanks to NBT and the research they facilitated. That helped me get into the core of what freedom actually meant. So the best thing about, our country is that these, it's all these freedom movements that emerged in different parts of the country were important in making India free. So be it not just in Delhi, not just, in the south or in the north or, in the west, east, in every little village there was a revolutionary. In every little tehsil, every place you found someone who was ready to lay down their life to make something happen. And this was one girl who not just made this happen but also broke a lot of gender norms at a time when gender parity was not even a word. We had not heard about alpha females. We were not talking about women being at the forefront of anything. I mean, we were still struggling with sati and the dowry piece. And then this woman emerged out of the blue, and I was like, this is the person I want to write about. So, Gaidin Liu's story emerges from this tri-junction, as he mentioned, of Assam, Nagaland and Manipur, where this little village called Puilon existed. She is supposed to have certain powers, certain healing powers with herbs and everything, which is why I made it into historical fiction, because we never know the truth of all these things. There's supposed to be a Bhuban caves up there where people go for hiking, and her older cousin Jadanang, who I've named Dikanang here, used to go there, got some ideas and enlightenment, revived the animistic form of living, living sustainably with animals and plants, and then came back, and then he realized that what they needed was to fight the British. So a whole thing ensued, and I had a very, illustrious experience writing this book, because I realized that a lot of the things that we hear and a lot of the things that we read are based on hearsay. So when you start researching for historical fiction, you have to, run through everything with a fine-toothed comb. So that was something which I learned. I'm a contemporary fiction writer primarily. But when I delved into this, I realized that this requires a lot more research, a lot more sincerity, and a lot more interest. So I'm happy that the book has gone out, the book has come out, and people and areas which are more underrepresented. Northeastern stories are not as commonplace as the others. We do not hear a lot of fables coming out. So someday I'm looking forward to saying, just like Chota Bheem, maybe, some other story of this girl who's done amazing things with animals, having a kinship with pythons, making things happen, and more such stories to come from that region. So this is where my journey started, and I'm looking forward to continuing it.
Thank you. Thank you, Ashisha. As I said before, I have some pointers. We'll come back to it after. And I see some nice emerging threads which can run through all authors perhaps. We'll see that later. Next we have Mithun Murali. And his book is titled Night of the Sea, the Saga of Kunjali Marakkar 4. It's a work of the historical fantasy genre written in English. The novel features the Kunjali Marakkars, the naval admirals of Kerala, and their campaign against the Portuguese Empire in the 16th century. The Marakkars were the first Asian admirals to challenge the naval superiority of the European power. Their contributions to India's maritime culture have been acknowledged by entities such as Indian Navy. The book aims to contextualize the great admirals as part of the proto-nationalist movements that eventually snowballed into the struggle of Indian independence. It also discusses how the idea of the nation was in vogue as far back as the early modern period of Indian history. The work is a historical fantasy which mixes a historical setting with a tinge of magic and fantasy in order to appeal to multiple demographics and readerships. The historical fantasy subgenre of historical fiction is extremely popular across the globe, with the likes of Abraham Lincoln, Vampire Hunter by Seth Graham Smith, and the Poppy War trilogy by R.F. Kuang, but it has been hitherto unexplored in India. Therein lies the significance of the novel.
So, Mithun, from the lands, can you take us on the voyage into the sea? Tell us about your...
Yeah, oh yeah, sure. Once again, thanks for having me here. Now, my book was an anomaly for two reasons. Number one, as you mentioned, it was part of the historical fantasy subgenre, which is where you take historical setting and mix it with a tinge of magic and fantasy and transform it into something else entirely. So you mentioned the example of Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter, the Poppy War trilogy, where there was the Opium War between Britain and China. That was featured as a historical fantasy novel by R.F. Kuang. That was also a popular example. So no matter how far I looked, I couldn't find a suitable counterpart to this pertaining to Indian history. So that's why I took this up. And not just that, I mean, most of you must have watched or read Game of Thrones, A Song of Ice and Fire and stuff, which is nothing more than British history. See, in the history of England, there were two houses, Houses York and House Lancaster. And so what George R.R. Martin, the writer, did was he took these houses, he renamed them to Houses Stark and Lannister, added a bunch of dragons and zombies, and voila, now there's the Game of Thrones that we know and love today. I mean, the significance of this whole thing, historical fantasy, whatever, is that it appeals to wider readership. I mean, there's a little kid with a Harry Potter book there. I'm sure if he reads this, he'll find my novel interesting. I'm sure people of all ages and nationalities and demographics will find it interesting. It is significant because our Prime Minister Modi talked about soft power and how it will put India on the map, on the global stage. And talking about soft power, it is said that the Western genes and Coca-Cola and Hollywood led to the destruction of the Soviet Union more than, and bringing down the Iron Curtain and the Berlin Wall, much more so than any nukes of America did. So I could get into the intricacies of writing historical fantasy later, but for the paucity of time, let's talk about the second reason why my book is an anomaly. It is set in the 16th century. So while writing this book, I had to, and while marketing it to an esteemed panel of judges from the National Book Trust and the Ministry of Culture, I had to explain why it is relevant in the context of the Indian independence movement. Because as per the popular notion, the Indian independence movement begins in the 19th century with the the first war of Indian independence, or the revolt of 1857, as the Europeans patronizingly call it. But then again, to quote R.C. Majumdar, the first war of Indian independence was neither first nor a war, nor was it for independence. And we had the Paika rebellion, the tribal rebellion in Odisha way before that, which is gaining prominence now. We have the Sannyasi rebellion. We have multitudes of rebellions which far predated 1857. And the idea that I'm grappling in this book is the distinction between nation and nationhood. Because nationhood is a term that came into vogue only in 21st century or 20th century. It came into vogue in political parlance because it's more of a nationhood refers to, nation state refers to a political identity, whereas the word nation refers to a shared cultural identity. So the argument that I'm trying to put forth in this historical fantasy novel is that the idea of the nation state of India came into vogue perhaps in 1947 or even 1950, but the idea of nation existed eons before that. For example, in the Vishnu Purana, it is mentioned that the land to the north of the Great Ocean and the south of the Himalayas, the Great Mountains, is Bharat. So the idea of Bharat, the idea of India as a nation existed hundreds of years, maybe thousands of years before the idea of nation, India as a nation state in modern democracy came into vogue. So these were the kind of ideas that I explored. Would love to chat more on this later. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you there.
The microphone continues to persist.
Mic struggles.
Hello. Can you hear me? Wonderful. Thank you, Mithun there. I liked your, the point that you brought in the end, nation state and nationhood. And in fact, in the light of Sri Aurobindo, he gave 5 dreams for new India on the eve of India's national independence for India. And the first dream talks about that united India. And I think it's the idea of nationhood, the idea of this united cultural India that he often refers to and writes about. Now, when you, coming back to the title of this today's topic, Rediscovery and Reimagination, you use the word retelling. So when you chose the subject, was there a conscious effort to tell the story, write a book in a new light, like Ashisha, you also alluded to not go towards the household names, the usual ones. So was there a conscious effort to look for these heroes who are in the nooks and corners somewhere? Or you just, chanced upon it, stumbled upon it? And when then you choose these names, how difficult is it to juxtapose them with the known, leaders of our independence or the struggle? So was there also a conscious effort to give it a flavor which is not the usual flavor of, organized, like you said, this Dijinliu seems like a spontaneous effort, and do you see a thread where there was a conscious effort to connect to the national or a larger picture, or is it just an individual, a micro kind of a revolt?
So I would say searching, yes, I made a conscious effort to search for the unsung heroes. Primarily, as I said, I'm a little attracted towards the underdogs, the people who don't get represented much. And I felt that the Northeast, in terms of parables, in terms of stories, I have not read much while growing up. And I call myself a person who's decently read well, in my childhood. I've not read any book which talks about these tales and folk tales. A lot of these are coming up recently, and I'm very happy about that. But I looked for these heroes, especially women who have, spearheaded these movements. And I found her especially intriguing because she was not in the limelight, as you correctly said. Jadonang, Haipo Jadonang was the one who had started the animist movement. And he had begun it with an idea to have a more sustainable form of a system where, their tribes would live with, the plants and animals in a kind of a symbiotic relationship, and they did believe in a certain system of gods, and I've mentioned those in the book, although this would include a fantasy element where there are some python gods and sort of they find them in the caves, etc. But then they realized that the bigger cause was nationalism, because they needed to have control of their lives and control of their land, because they realized they had to pay a house tax of 3 rupees every month, and 3 rupees at that time probably amounted to quite a bit. So those feelings, doing forced labor, there's a particular word called Potang Bekari and Potang Sengkhai, which means any administrative officer, if they came to their village, they would have to provide food, water, and lodging for them with nothing in return. And everything that they were growing, they actually owed to the British officials. So all these were, of course, unfair, and even the king of Churachandpur in Manipur could not speak much against it, because at that time, things were changing, the dynamics were changing. Every king was kind of in alliance with the East India Company, and they had somehow changed the dynamics so that they did not have much power. They were titular rulers. So then it came down to the common man, the common man and woman to actually take initiatives, and Jadonang did just that. He amassed a bunch of people. There were, again, the Northeast is a very diverse community. When I started reading about it, I was like, I'm going to stick to only a couple of tribes because I don't know much. But among the ones I read about, the Rongmei and the Zim and the Liangmei, they had a lot of rifts among themselves. So what Jadonang tried to do was send his emissaries to different villages with a token and say that if you accept to be a part of this rebellion, just send this back or some kind of a thing. And then they realized that everybody started collecting. But Jadonang, as I told you before, he got executed unfairly, and then Gaidinliu came into the picture. She was already doing some healing process, and she was already in the process of, she was a lone warrior, you're right. She was a lone warrior. She was not looking for any particular example. But then she took on the mantle of this freedom movement that Jadonang left and took it on completely. She led a rebellion in Pulomi. She led a rebellion in Hangrum. And this entire fight changed the entire scene of the Heraka movement. And post that, I think the rest is history. After independence, she went to jail, the Tura jail, and she was freed only. She spent about 14 years in jail, and finally in 1947 she was freed. So these are some kind of micro movements. I feel all of these micro movements across the country contributed to a bigger nationalist movement.
That's right. And also, Swardi, I would like to come
Yeah.
to you. If you can also add back then, we were ruled by the British, and usually it's the history is written by the winners. And when we do the research also, it's usually their point of view, and we need to somehow deduce perhaps the opposing point of view, which may or may not be true. How do you come to that? When you go about researching, about rediscovering or retelling a past fact, which is fairly gone beyond the living memories as such, or from the popular culture, how do you go about it?
Am I audible?
Yes.
Right, so I think in that sense, there's a lot of work that often needs to be undertaken in order to get at the perspective that you're talking about. For me, it was essentially primary source documents. Now, essentially at that point of time, there were several of these notable households. So you had the Talukdari estates. We had the Zamindari estates in Bengal. I think Sanjeev sir yesterday talked about the Baro Bhuiya movement, against the Mughal impressment in Bengal. So, kind of similarly, all of these households, they used to have their own collections. They used to have their own commissions. Ashisha mentioned letters, right? I mean, letters which were exchanged between, these, talukdars, between members of the elite section that, where I think they took the first blow from the fact that the English had come into power and the Nawab was, no more in authority. To talk about how I went about unearthing those facets. I think in terms of the visual details, in terms of the visual depictions, it was more about traveling to that place, and the interviews. I think interviews are very personal, right? So if you have a descendant, so I spoke to a few of them, I cannot disclose their names unfortunately, because of certain restrictions, but I spoke to a few of the families around the estate of Kalakankar. Kalakankar is the name of Lal Pratap's estate, and they were in very good, association with Lal Pratap's family back in the day. And I think Lal Pratap also had a son called, Rampal Singh, who later became a politician. He was probably elected as a member of parliament in independent India. So some of the documentation that they had, during the first war of Indian independence probably came into light after, Rampal Singh gained some popularity. But much of that remained undiscovered. So, and of course, unpublished. So in fact, I started my research with National Archives, in Kolkata, and I also went to a few libraries, including the Jawaharlal Nehru Memorial Library in Delhi. And I was actually led to, these familial collections by the curators over there, because apparently, the repositories we've got, most of these, like you said, are government documents, are government collections. They've got a very, what should I call it? Every human has their own point of view, right? It's very subjective for us. So there's this bias that we've got in ourselves, when writing about a particular thing. So the colonial accounts that matter are very biased because they talk about the colonial perspective. And so in order to be able to uncover that, I had to go for the primary familial, collections kept within the familial trusts that are housed at Kalakankar and elsewhere, including at Kaiser Bagh. Kaiser Bagh was the center of the Nawab's regnant authority in Lucknow. It's basically in old Lucknow, in present day we call it the old Lucknow. So that was one bit of it. Second, if I could probably add on to something that Ashisha mentioned, it was all these there were these micro movements, that came together to add to the bigger picture. Lal Pratap, for instance, I think you mentioned this in the bio. He led the contingent called Pratap Jung, which included 1,000, man company. It was a 1,000-man contingent from his estate. It was not just him who participated, in the rebellion, as the Europeans call it, in the first war of Indian independence, and it was all these estates. So in fact, I think there's a popular historical fiction, I don't recall the name at the moment, that talks about this chapati thing that happened way back in Oudh, where people exchange chapatis as a sign that there's going to be some, widespread rebellion against the British repression. So, that's a very interesting way to look at it. I'm not sure if that happened because, again, these are things you'd not be able to uncover. So what you could do is, exchange of letters and things definitely did happen. So the fact that this was an organized, sort of resistance against the company authority at that point of time, and particularly in the case of Lal Pratap, is because we have a very organized, very disciplined, 1,000-man contingent that he led.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, that's particularly something I found fascinating, to kind of relate that and connect the dots with the bigger national picture. The fact that they were able to comprehend the threat that the authority of the company possessed, to not just the people within their communities, not just the estate of Kalakankar, but to the broader, region of Oudh and, nationwide for that matter.
Yeah, thank you. I think even if they were like disparate movements, but there is a nationhood, the soul which was trying to come together, even in a disconnected way, but they were all struggling. The human stories were the same. Mithun, did you have an advantage in your subject because your protagonists were the winners? So they wrote history, but then you had a disadvantage that it was 500 years ago. So how did you manage to do the research?
To the contrary, the protagonist of my story, Kunyali Marakya the fourth, there were 4 admirals. The fourth, number 4 is the chief protagonist of my novel. He was not a winner because he was captured and executed in 1600. But the movement as a whole, the Marakyas as a whole, were successful. Why? Because they were instrumental in restricting the Portuguese Empire to Goa and certain pockets of the Malabar subcontinent. Sorry, the Malabar coastline. The same way as we discussed, as we had a chat before the session, the same way Martanda Varma defeated the Dutch Empire in the Kolachal War of 1741, I think, and sort of made the Dutch Empire pack their bags. So there's a reason why the British Empire takes center stage in our history of national tuffles and struggles, and not the Portuguese, and not the Dutch, and not the French. And it weren't the Portuguese because of because of the Marakyas. So in that sense, yes, they were winners, but no, I didn't find it easy at all, because this story takes place in the 16th century. So a lot of archival records were lost. I went to Goa to refer to the archival records. I went to a museum in Calicut where they stored all the weapons, the rusted swords, blades, axes, and cannonballs of the Portuguese and the Kunyali Marakyas. And a funny story, a person approached me saying he was the descendant of the admirals, great admirals. So I spent the next half an hour interviewing him. He gave me lots of info as to his food habits and cultural preferences and etc. And when I was about to leave, another bunch came and kicked him out and said, he's wrong, I'm the descendant of Kunyali Marakya. So there's a concept called fault lines in history, right? So there's a break in history, there's a break in genealogy. So this is where we Yuva authors come in, because we are not just authors, we are also researchers, because it was partly a 6-month research fellowship. So I think we are contributing to the discourse. We are exploring hitherto unexplored regions and historical figures. We're even doing constructing ancestral trees and doing genealogical work. So in that sense, it was not at all easy. It was extremely tough, but it was extremely rewarding as well.
Did you reach out to the Portuguese to give you the other side of the story?
Not at all.
Okay. How, you talked about this capital-centric, no? One of you, that all our stories are somewhere revolving around the capitals of then nation states, whatever it was. What do you think is the relevance of this PM Yuva project to unearth, to go beyond the known geographies also, for that matter, and then unearth these stories? And even so, what's the role of institutional history telling, no, in a way, the support to unearth, do the research, and even give you other kind of supports?
So I'll just give you an example before I get started. We have a friend of ours from Karnataka, Tejas Badala. So he wrote a work in Kannada literature. This was set in the Western Ghats. I think it was actually set in Kerala, was it? Yeah, so he talks about how the people out there used Kalaripayattu as a form of resistance, martial arts. When we talk about rebellion, we talk about resistance, we think of, guns and, weapons and all sorts of bloodshed. And I think the fact that martial arts too played a significant role, traditional martial arts like Silambam and, the Paika rebellion for that matter was primarily, it was very instrumental in popularizing Silambam at that point of time. And Kalaripayattu was used in the Deccan. So yeah, I mean, to go beyond the ordinary is not just to go beyond the capitals. It's also to venture beyond the charted territories. So, for example, Ashisha's book is set in the Northeast, which has comparatively is comparatively underrepresented when it comes to the Indian literary representation. You've got certain works from the South. You've got certain works from Bengal. Certain regions like Tamluk, which are very active in the 1942 Quit India movement. So if I talk about the scheme in general, the scheme, because the thematic component, I think, was about unsung heroes, authors or applicants in general delved, further to explore the causations of some of these, capital-centric movements. So in a way, like I said, like Ashisha too mentioned, all of these micro-movements contributed to one big movement that kind of was brought to the capital in some way or the other. So for example, if I talk about my work, Pratap Jung, you had several talukdars doing their own independent little movements out there, resisting the British in their own independent areas. And at the end, because Dalhousie felt that, it would better to get the Nawab impressed with a certain image and then, get the territory annexed under the pretext of alleged misrule. So, he did that. And in a way, all of these talukdars, they saw that as, they took that as a precedent for what was coming next. So, I think that was because that was what led them to the capital to join hands with the Nawab's people and the mutineers who came from the north to resist the English. So yes, the PM Yuva Fellowship does in fact urge you to explore beyond what has been explored. Of course, the popular characters we talk about have significant contributions to the freedom movement, but I think there's also a need to represent the underrepresented because, like Mithun said, we're contributing to the discourse and not just essentially fictionalizing stuff and writing about it in the popular domain. I think that's my take on it.
Yeah, I would like to have response from you two, brief one, and then we open up for some questions also. Your views on the need for institutional support.
So I feel writers, I've often said this before, that writers do not have a set path. Artists, creators, just like doctors, lawyers, and engineers do. We know there's an exam and you cross it and then you get placed. It is difficult for creators to find their own way, and schemes such as this kind of provide a launch pad for them. So one huge benefit is this. The second thing is, I would kind of give it a commercial spin thanks to my marketing background. I would say that, you get the first mover advantage when you delve into a story which has not been told before. These are some of the, especially because, there were many young freedom fighters, actually, very young freedom fighters, kids, 10-year-olds, 11-year-olds. Guy Liu was 13. I don't even imagine thinking so much when I was 13. So such people who were, motivated to do a lot more than just live their lives, then I think those stories need to be told. And when a scheme such as this brings out or aims to bring out these stories, I think it is only for the best. And of course, as everybody mentioned, every cog, every such micro movement across the country may just seem like a cog in the wheel or, in the entire machine. But, even if such a cog goes missing, it is essential for the machine to work. The machine will not work without these important cogs. So every such part is important. Every story has a part to play in the bigger narrative, in the bigger Indian narrative. And I feel that's the whole idea of, unity in diversity, in how this scheme has brought about different stories together and is aiming to get many, many more unsung stories. And I'm looking forward to all further treasures coming out of it.
Yeah. And I'm looking forward to the questions also. Yes, you may have to come use this mic.
You want me to sit there?
No, you can use this mic. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, gentlemen, I am just a fence sitter. I don't read much. Of course, I'm interested in literature. And so, unfortunately, I have not come across any of your words. There is one commonality I found now in all the works what you three people have been delving. It so happens that we are talking about unsung heroes and heroines. And they were losers because they ended up losing their lives. They are martyrs. That's a commonality. And, well, we understand why they lost. I mean, at least we can comprehend why they lost. Because there was so much of backstabbing happening. And one more reason why I feel sad about this is that, those aggressors who came down here for the sake of trade and as when they had to build their forts and ramparts and moats, whatever it is, to keep on their economic aggression, they were really outnumbered. We understand they are outnumbered. They were over here, and so what benefited them was our disunity, and of course there was disunity. But again, when it comes to the real core of it, we understand there were a lot of familial prestige the backstabber would have gained. That's what I understand. The backstabber would have gained. He in a way, he was displacing by supporting the foreign aggressor. That's what I understand. That's what I understand. So it's just an observation, and again, what I understand is that so I think that's been repeated in the entire history. I think it happens all over the world. Like what I understand is that Hitler understood if at all 12,000 Englishmen could rule millions of people over here, why a few million Germans cannot rule the entire world? I think that gave a start to the Second World War. So one more thing what I would like to see is that someday I would like to hear from you people, a story from the point of view of the backstabber. I think why? I mean, he also had a reason. So that's what my request is all about. Thanks.
Can I add on to that? Something concerning that.
And also I will add one more point, and you can all give your closing remarks, because I'm told to, the time is running out. I would like to bring to the title of this session, History as Rediscovery and Reimagination. Like he rightly pointed out, what's the larger perspective? What is the larger narrative that we are trying to tell ourselves here? Is this the necessity for unity, the human unity, the pride with our culture, standing up for it? So what is it in your view that the lessons that we can take to the future? You are all, after all, young writers. So what's the necessity of retelling, reimagining, re-narrating, rediscovery even? What's the point? Maybe we can start with Mithun.
Yeah. The point is always to recognize the pitfalls and make sure that we avoid them. To add to what he so rightfully put, why did we lose for so many years? Because there was no unifying framework as to what it meant to be an Indian. For example, even the novel I mentioned the Portuguese Empire in India was called the Estado da India. So the Empire of India. And they had a branch, the Portuguese had a branch in Indonesia as well, which was called the Empire to the East of India. So our enemies had a perfect conception as to what India entailed, but we did not. We were sort of mired in a regional, or dare I say parochial mindedness, and that's what acted as a roadblock to a victory for so many years. In unearthing all of these accounts and narratives, we sort of strive to highlight the pitfalls, and so that we can hope to be better citizens and better individuals.
So just adding one line, because he's covered most of it, is that all of us have to be proud of our identities as Indians and the rich heritage we come from, and the wide and the extremely varied things and the good, the good histories that we have. And the more we come up with it, the more we unearth it, the more we read it, I think the more we're going to realize that this is what we stood up for. And we can go very, very far. And had we not been into all these fragmented little kings fighting over small lands, fragmented battles and stuff, then I don't think this would have happened. So all we needed was pride in who we are, exactly that. And the aim of these books and coming up with these stories is just to reinforce the fact and to retell those stories, to reimagine our future so that we can fast forward into it and not get worked up about little things and little disagreements and little problems that we've come up with. So the idea has to be very sharp where we are moving towards.
So just to add on to both of that, since I am particularly a history student, so I have this notion that, it's all about contributing to the scholarship. There's an existing scholarship, right? So you're basically getting to contribute to that. I'm very grateful for that, in fact. I think much of that has already been stated. In fact, the scheme also was under the broader purview of the Ek Bharat, Shresht Bharat, to highlight all sorts of little movements from across India, pan-India movements, in fact. And some of our works were also based on, I think, the manner in which the independence movement was carried forward, abroad, essentially out of India. So there's this need to, understand what it meant to stand for, the stances that were taken up at that point of time. But just to come back to, also what's stated over here. And what Mithun, in fact, stated, the Portuguese were kind of, I think the Portuguese faced resistance at the hands of the Marathas. I think the Portuguese also faced resistance at the hands of, Chimaji Appa of the Maratha Empire. The Dutch were restricted by Martanda Varma. It's not particularly because of that that the English came into, supremacy. I think the English dominance also has a lot to do with the soft power thing we're talking about, the cultural thing, the fact that they were able to ingrain in us the idea of the supremacy of the English language. Macaulay Minute becomes really significant in this light. So the French, for example, had a very prominent, establishment in India. I think the French under Nagore Pondicherry, for that matter, was a very French-dominated region. The Anglo-French Carnatic Wars were all about, the supremacy and everything. But one reason why the backstabbing and everything happened, and this is something I've discovered after having gone through some of these contemporary accounts, is because some of these local landlords, some of the feudals, Ashisha talked about kings fighting between themselves. Some of these local feudals wanted to come into power. Say, for example, if you have 4 different brothers and one succeeds to the throne over the other, then the other naturally allies with the opposite camp that you have over there. So it's about power dynamics. And the English had become a substantial power dynamic in India because of their, firstly, the trading capacity that they had, the forts and everything had opened up. They were a mercantile company, the East India Company, but also because I think they had this sort of intellectual dominance. They were able to ingrain in us the idea of the supremacy of the English language, and the fact that they had a very organized hierarchical structure in India kind of fostered this belief in the backstabbers that they'd be having a very stable future ahead after probably deposing whoever their opponent was. So I think that too contributed to the motivation for these backstabbers. The fact that the English were a substantial and a stable authority in India at that point of time to kind of go against the freedom fighters or the unsung heroes we're talking about.
So I have one last question, Mithun. What is the future of books in India? Paperbacks, hardbacks, what do you see?
The future of books in India is looking bright. Once again, we need to be clear as to our conception of books. Do we include e-books in that? I certainly do, Kindle books and the like, especially with the advent of social media and platforms like Instagram. There's Instagrammable poetry, like poetry tailor-made to the short attention span of people who scroll social media, right? Like 4 to 5 lines. And I keep thinking how history is a circle, because these Instagrammable poetry of 2 or 3 lines, they're starkly reminiscent of the haiku poetry that we have in Japan, because they only have, I think, 14 syllables to convey a picturesque idea or poignant image. So history is a cycle. So it's a graph. It keeps going up and down, and it's a cycle. And books are never going out of fashion.
So it is, data says that Indians have there are maximum readers in India actually. So that's a good thing. However, it is also said that writers now have to contest for the 2 hours of time per week that people spend on reading. So that is a little sad because we spend a lot of time on OTTs. So I think the future of books will have to be shaped by maybe the media. So writers might have to like diversify a little into screens, into you see a lot of books being made to screen, but then yes, we will have to get back the whole idea of reading paperbacks and the whole idea of enjoying a book by the roadside. The future is definitely good, but it'll require a lot of reading at the school level, because I think the whole idea of sitting down at home and reading has kind of gone out of the window. This is what I personally feel. So that will have to be reinstituted. But yeah, otherwise we're looking forward to it.
Well, I think they covered most of it. That's the disadvantage of being the last person to, speak on the topic. But yeah, I mean, the future of books, in my opinion, looks bright. So long you consider the different forms of media out there. So long you consider the different formats out there. If you're specifically talking about paperbacks, I'm not particularly sure. I'm nobody from the industry. I'm not a publisher or, an agent working to understand the dynamics of the industry. But I think there's a very shifting dynamics out there because, like Mithun shared, we have a very short attention span these days. So it's mostly into social media, OTT, but yes, storylines are going to be there. The media, I think it's diversifying. And it's important for the writer or for the historian or for the storyteller to adapt to these, changing dynamics and, keep their storyline moving. So I think that's a bit of my...
Not talking about the publishers, you as a person, if you have the option of having a Kindle book or a paperback, what would you prefer?
If I'm on a trip, I would go for a Kindle.
Yeah.
Because that's easy to, get through when at the airports and everything. But yeah, I do prefer paperback. So I am an antique book collector, in fact.
Oh.
I, for instance, recently acquired a copy of Byron's Need of Fatality, the first edition that came out in England in March 1932. And, this was a part of the RSRN collection at the Indian Council of World Affairs. So yes, I'm an antique collector. I've got a few mini libraries and everything. But at the end of the day, if I were to go on a trip and everything, I'd have to diversify my media as well because you just can't carry the whole bunch, Yeah. So it's definitely important to have things in a very small, pad or Kindle for that matter, where you can access them at your convenience from wherever you are. So that does matter too.
Nothing is better than the smell of paperbacks.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Join the club. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Suhadya. Thank you, Ashisha. Thank you, Mithun. I think as long as we have writers, young writers, who are brave enough to take up projects like this, who are ready to tell us stories, make us rediscover, make us reimagine our history, our present, our future, I think I would safely bet on, the power of stories. Thank you everyone for also attending this session, and